Imagine living your life behind bars, imprisoned for a crime you didn't commit. For the wrongfully convicted, that nightmare is a reality, one that's been played out countless times in courtrooms just like this one. The fate of one person resting on eyewitness testimony, forensic evidence, and even jailhouse informants. Tonight we'll take a closer look at the wrongfully convicted and the circumstances surrounding their imprisonment, what went wrong, and how does our justice system avoid making the same painful mistakes again.
Can you give us a quick comment?
Fucking camera stuffed in my face. Ask me how that feels, you fucking clown.
Kyle Unger is understandably an angry man. He was released from prison just weeks ago after nearly 14 years behind bars for a murder he may not have committed. In June 1990, the body of 16-year-old Bridget Grenier was found at an outdoor music festival near Rose Isle, Manitoba. She had been beaten and sexually assaulted.
The body was floating half submerged in the water there. Okay.
Charged with the crime was 19-year-old Kyle Unger. He was convicted after hair found at the scene was identified as his, and a jailhouse informant said Unger confessed to the crime while behind bars. He was sentenced to life in prison. But after serving almost 14 years of his life sentence, 33-year-old Unger was granted bail after a judge ruled there are very serious concerns that Unger may have been wrongfully convicted, and apart from this conviction, there is no reason to refuse to release Mr. Unger. The judge ordered Unger's release because two pieces of evidence, being the hair sample and the confession to the jailhouse informant, have been withdrawn by the Crown.
Can you give us any comment whatsoever?
Yeah, stick that camera up your ass, you fucking clown.
Angry and frustrated, Unger was told he would have to abide by a list of bail conditions, including residing at his parents' home in Merritt, BC. His lawyer says this is a natural reaction after spending time behind bars for a crime you didn't commit.
It is typical to be very, very fearful at first. You mentioned Mr. Driscoll. I remember how fearful he was for the first several weeks after he was released.
I did not kill Perry. I've said it time and time again, and I'll keep on saying it.
I did not kill Perry. Perry was a friend of mine.
I wouldn't kill anybody, let alone a friend.
In 1991, James Driscoll was accused of murdering his friend Perry Dean Harder. At the time, 3 hairs found in Driscoll's van, believed to belong to Harder, were used to link him to the crime. Driscoll was sentenced to 25 years in prison for the murder, but after serving more than 12 years behind bars, DNA testing showed that the hairs were not Harder's. The credibility of key Crown witnesses also raised concerns.
For years, I've been asked to be accountable for something I didn't do.
Similarly, Thomas Sofino also spent time in a Manitoba prison for a crime he didn't commit. In 1991, 16-year-old Barbara Stoppel was found in a bathroom of the donut shop where she worked as a nighttime waitress. She had been strangled with a piece of twine and left to die. 3 days later, she was pronounced dead, and a manhunt was launched for her killer. At the time, police released this composite sketch of the suspect. It bore a striking resemblance to a man named Thomas Sofino. Police also thought he looked like the killer. He wore glasses, had a mustache, and like the suspect, Sofino also wore a cowboy hat. In 1983, Sofino was convicted of killing Stoppel. He spent 4 years in jail before he was granted a new trial and acquitted due to a lack of evidence, including mistaken identification. He too maintained his innocence throughout his incarceration and the 3 trials he went through before being acquitted.
The past 18 years of my life have been very difficult.
Thomas Sofino was exonerated and an inquiry was held to uncover what went wrong. He was eventually awarded $2.6 million in compensation. But perhaps the most publicized example of wrongful conviction was the David Milgaard case. 36 years ago, David Milgaard was your typical 16-year-old hippie, a drifter following the Flower Child movement across Canada.
They were on the move, and my son David was moving right along with them.
It was January 1969. Milgaard and 2 friends were passing through Saskatoon the same day 20-year-old nursing student Gail Miller was found dead in a back alley. She had been brutally raped, her throat slashed, and she was stabbed several times. 1 year later, Milgaard was convicted of that crime and sentenced to life in prison.
I am satisfied that justice was meted out by the court.
So Gail Miller's murderer is in jail?
As far as I'm concerned, that is correct.
For the next 23 years, justice officials and police stood behind Milgaard's conviction, proven beyond a reasonable doubt, they said, in a court of law. But during that same time, Milgaard repeatedly maintained his innocence.
You know, would you actually go in and say you did something like that if you really didn't do it?
Well, it's been a miscarriage of justice, and that's it.
It took his mother's tenacity and persistence.
I chased people around. I badgered people. I went undercover many times
before the Supreme Court of Canada agreed to grant Milgaard a new trial. But ultimately, it was DNA evidence that cleared Milgaard's name. DNA that proved this man, Larry Fisher, was the one who raped and murdered Gail Miller in 1969.
Very early that morning, Fisher went out and, according to the evidence, tried to attack a woman. She repelled the attack. She screamed and ran. And Gail Miller was Larry Fisher's second victim that morning.
In Canada, there are more than 9 cases where individuals have been freed of crimes they didn't commit. And according to the Association for the Wrongfully Convicted, many more cases are pending. So how could these supposedly violent criminals be convicted of something they didn't do? Coming up next, we'll explore the power of eyewitness testimony and police tunnel vision, and the role they play when police officers and the Justice Department get it wrong. Welcome back. Justice is supposed to be blind, but wrongful convictions are often the result of human error. The testimony of one person could send another to prison for the rest of his life. Or police bias can result in evidence pointing to innocence being ignored. This is just one example of how a well-intentioned eyewitness and police investigators can convict someone of a crime they didn't commit. North Carolina resident Jennifer Thompson knows all too well the kind of power eyewitness testimony holds in a court of law. In the summer of 1984, she identified a 22-year-old black man as the person who broke into her apartment and raped her at knife point.
First of all, I thought maybe it was somebody who'd broken in, maybe was there to rob me. I'd startled him, and so I said, if you want my car, my credit card, all my money, you can have it, just please leave and don't hurt me. And he told me he didn't want my money. And that's when I knew, I just, you just know that I was going to be raped.
At 5'1" and only 105 pounds, Jennifer was no physical match for her attacker. So the straight-A college student began to devise a plan to pay close attention to the features of her rapist.
I wanted to see if maybe he was missing a tooth, or he had a scar, or a body piercing, or a tattoo, or something that I thought couldn't be altered days later. I paid attention to the shape of his eyes, his hairline, his chin, his lips, everything that I could possibly pay attention to.
During that time, Jennifer was repeatedly sexually assaulted, but maintained calm until she was able to make her escape.
And I said, well, I'm really afraid of knives, and if you'll take the knife and walk out my front door and down the steps and drop the knife on the hood of my car, you can come back in. And he dropped the knife outside of my front door, came back in, grabbed my arm, and I had determined I wasn't going back. He would have to kill me in the hallway first. And I said, well, I'm really thirsty. Can I go in the kitchen and get myself a drink? So I went in the kitchen, I began to make noise with ice cubes and drawers and cabinets and water running, and I opened the back door, and at that moment I just took a big deep breath and prayed and took off running.
Jennifer found help and was taken to the police station, where she gave officers a detailed description of the man who raped her.
They asked me if I could describe and make a description. I said, yes, I can. And I began to articulate his height, his weight, his complexion. And they said, do you think you can make a composite sketch? And I said, I think so.
What she came up with was this.
The police artist looked at me and said, "Does this look like the man who attacked you?" And I said, "Yes."
A few days later, Jennifer picked out her attacker from a series of photographs and then the ultimate test, a police lineup to make a positive ID. The man she pointed to was Ronald Cotton.
My testimony truly was what put Ronald Cotton in prison for life.
But during his incarceration, an inmate named Bobby Poole bragged he was the rapist. A second trial was held and both men stood before Jennifer. Still, she insisted Cotton was her attacker.
Absolutely positive. There wasn't a doubt in my mind.
11 years later, DNA evidence proved Cotton was not the rapist, that in fact it was Bobby Poole. According to Jennifer, the mistaken identification can be traced back to this composite sketch.
So I'm now looking at a photo that's 3 years old, and I'm comparing it subconsciously to the last visual I have, which is a composite sketch. Now when I go to do a physical lineup, my last memory is of a photo, and I am choosing a person who resembles a photo that resembles a composite sketch that resembled my attacker.
A faulty memory isn't the only factor that can lead to wrongful conviction. Police bias or tunnel vision can also play a significant role, like in the case of David Milgaard, who spent 23 years behind bars for the rape and murder of Gail Miller, a crime that was actually committed by this man, Larry Fisher.
Before David Milgaard, and even at the beginning of the David Milgaard saga, there was tremendous reluctance to even consider the possibility of an error.
We provided a fair bit of information regarding the tip that we had about Larry Fisher. And one of the great failings in the system was that the Department of Justice or the RCMP or whoever they were using failed to act on that information.
The courts found Mr. Driscoll guilty of that murder.
Winnipeg Police Chief Jack Kowalski has served with the force for the past 32 years. He says police tunnel vision, similar to the kind involved in the Milgaard investigation, can best be described as an investigator bias.
Where police in particular, and I'll speak to the police role, where they would determine a theory, determine an assumption relative to a case, and as a result of that focus in on one or maybe a couple of people who they believe are totally responsible for the criminal act and do everything they can to to gather evidence that would ensure a conviction in court.
In Milgaard's case, lawyers argued not only did police blatantly ignore evidence that pointed to another suspect, but they also bullied witnesses into giving false testimony.
You got very young witnesses, they're 16, 17-year-olds who at the beginning simply tell the truth, which was that nothing ever happened. And then police develop a theory as to what happened. And after hours and hours of questioning, these young people adopt the theory.
Iwatsky admits the techniques surrounding the Milgaard investigation would be considered out of date by today's standards, including other forms of tunnel vision, like police encouraging witnesses they identified the right suspect.
We've learned from that because, quite frankly, that's how police would operate, because we thought that was the right thing to do. It's been recently, I would say within the last 10 years, that I think we've all come to the understanding and the acknowledgement that those things are not productive in terms of getting to the truth of a matter.
Iwatsky says over the years, a number of changes have also been made to the policies and procedures associated with criminal investigations.
The changes in technology, the changes in forensics have been incredible over the last few years. And I think coupled with that, with good training, good policies, good practices in place, it allows our officers a bigger toolbox with many more tools to ensure that they are gathering the best evidence.
Coming up next, we'll look at the forensic science used in police investigations. A powerful investigative tool, but still not infallible. Over the years, some forms of forensic science have come under fire for being less than scientific. We'll take a look at those methods and explore the latest forensic tool, DNA profiling, when Blind Justice continues. Welcome back. Forensic science,
It's a term you've probably heard before countless times on television cop shows, but it can be best described as the biological evidence left at the scene of a crime, the glue that has the potential to link a suspect to a crime scene. Over the years, a variety of forensic techniques have been used by police during the course of their investigations. Some of those methods have since been discredited, while others are still in use. Here's a look inside the world of real-life CSIs and the tools they use to link a suspect to a crime.
DNA. It contains all the information for human cell growth and development, and within it lies the genetic blueprint that makes each person unique.
99.9% of our DNA is the same. It needs to be in order for us to survive and exist as human beings. But there is a small fraction of DNA between us that is different. And it's well known that there are these differences. And it's the differences between individuals in their DNA that make it a powerful tool for investigative purposes.
First used in England in the early 80s, DNA analysis has quickly grown to become the most accepted and credible form of forensic science.
We can determine a DNA profile from a known sample and a DNA profile from a question sample and compare those two DNA profiles to determine whether or not those samples came from the same individual or from different individuals.
And because DNA is found in all cells, it has the potential to be extracted from several sources.
Blood, hair, saliva, semen, skin cells that you might lose when you touch something, teeth, bones, all your organs of your body.
And because of DNA's power to place a suspect at a crime scene, it's used in a wide range of investigations.
It's used in homicide investigations, sexual assaults, aggravated assaults, armed robberies, any crime where there is the potential for biological trace evidence to be left behind. There is the potential that DNA testing could be involved in that investigation.
But what are the chances that the results of DNA testing could be wrong?
Even with DNA evidence, it is not perfect. Nothing in human affairs is perfect.
According to this defense attorney, while DNA is a powerful tool linking a suspect to a crime, it also has the potential to be wrong.
People should not overestimate DNA evidence. There are issues surrounding DNA evidence. For example, DNA evidence does involve a judgment call by the examiner as to whether there is identity of the peaks.
It's those judgment calls that Gold argues can often lead to wrongful imprisonments.
There's no doubt that a lot of forensic science contributes to wrongful convictions because it's not very scientific.
Perhaps the most recognized form of forensic science no longer used is the lie detector.
There are great issues about the polygraph, which you may know. It's not really a lie detector, and as a result, it's even illegal to use it in many provinces. But there's other things, footprint evidence. There's a very famous professor who went around lecturing in courts on footprint evidence. In fact, in a case in Manitoba, which the appeal court considered and upheld 2-1, this woman claimed to be able to provide information to identify perpetrators from footprint evidence. Well, it was all bogus.
And the list of so-called junk science doesn't end there.
There's a Dutch policeman who goes around arguing for the admissibility of earprint evidence, so that an earprint was found at a break and enter, and this policeman claims to be able to identify the perpetrator and match it to the accused. There's even a professor going around with what are called brain prints, where supposedly if you have certain information in your brain, your reaction shows up on a machine, and that somehow shows that you do know about these things. And I have to tell you that the FBI is using it in terrorist cases to examine whether people have knowledge of certain things that they deny knowing.
Gold says even some traditional forms of forensic science, like fingerprint analysis, needs to be looked at through a microscope.
This idea about no two fingerprints alike, first of all, it's an assumption, and secondly, in many ways, it's a red herring. The issue isn't whether two fingerprints are alike. It's like people. Are two people similar enough to be mistaken one for the other? Are two fingerprints similar enough to be mistaken one for the other?
While fingerprint analysis raised a red flag for Gold, it's still considered a reliable source of forensic evidence by the courts. That's no longer the case for hair comparison evidence, a technique used in many wrongful conviction cases, like James Driscoll, who spent 12 years behind bars for the murder of Perry Dean Harder, and Kyle Unger, who was recently granted bail after hair evidence that placed him at the 1990 murder of 16-year-old Bridget Grenier proved to belong to somebody else. The once widely used form of evidence has now been deemed an inaccurate method of forensic science.
In the old days, and it is now, thank God, the old days, they used to take a hair from a crime scene and compare it with the hair of a suspect and purport to be able to say that this hair came from the same source as that hair. In other words, this is the suspect's hair.
Police say the only way to link a suspect to a hair is through DNA, a method RCMP forensic scientists maintain is an accurate form of testing.
Whether or not the DNA evidence is accepted, that doesn't necessarily mean that we are wrong. We do everything in our power to ensure that the test results that we provide to the police investigator are correct.
While it's a powerful investigative tool to help police put away the bad guy, forensic science is also a valuable source in defense of the wrongfully convicted. Through DNA profiling and analysis, the wrongfully convicted are freed for crimes they didn't commit. And in many cases, the right person is sent to jail. But it can be a lonely and often futile fight for an inmate who is proclaiming his innocence after being convicted of a serious crime. Thank you for watching.